Hello, I'm David Morris and welcome back to Risk. I'm reading and commenting on my book, A New Era of Risk, and we are in chapter 1 and we're talking about these new seismic, world-changing events that are occurring in the 2020s and thinking through what these mean for the international system, what do they mean for businesses, for all of us active in the international system, in the real world. And so in particular, last time I was talking about the geopolitical risks of this increasing contest between the United States and China. So I'm going to pick up here talking about, I'll continue commenting before I start to read, talking about the decline of trust and confidence in interdependence. Interdependence being a fancy word really for globalization, that many people in the West, but not only in the West, are losing their confidence in a system of rules, a system of norms and standards where nations are on a relatively level playing field because people don't trust that it is really level when they look at subsidies and other activities going on behind borders. So let's get into this decline of interdependence. To be sure, interdependence was in crisis by 2020 amidst a trade war, geopolitical confrontation, pandemic, failure to arrest worsening climate change, and declining trust all round. While the liberal international order, a phrase we often use, arguably never extended far beyond the rich world, the US had, during the globalization era, exhibited confidence in its universalistic mission to lead the world. It certainly possessed unrivaled hard power, soft power, and smart power, as Joseph Nye talks about. Following its financial crisis of 2008, however, US confidence appeared to collapse. A growing awareness of the deep internal cleavages generated by decades of compounding structural inequality within the United States appeared to explain a growing climate of fear and insecurity amongst demographically significant constituencies in the US who did not welcome the dramatic improvement in global equality that had been ushered in by East Asian growth. So this irony, really, that global equality that globalization brought about, this massive increase in wealth in the developing world, hundreds of millions of people moving out of poverty, this increase in equality that the United Nations has tracked very well through this period, to around 2020, it had been a great success if you're in the developing world, and perhaps in Australia, where I'm sitting. But if you're in much of the West, it didn't feel like things were getting more equal. It felt like things were getting more unequal. And so I think that's part of the explanation for why the zeitgeist changed. The new populist politics that took hold was deeply sceptical of interdependence and hostile towards international organisations and norms, believing, for example, that China was gaining at the expense of US manufacturing and blaming China for its merchandise trade deficit. I mean, this is ironic, isn't it? Because, of course, the United States deliberately shifted its industries to China to take advantage of low-cost manufacturing. The US actually deliberately created this deficit where they were importing low-cost goods from the US and, of course, exporting high-value services and other things to China as well. But the irony was that this really had become unacceptable to large sections of the US community that was starting to blame China for what had been going on in previous decades. The withdrawal of the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which later became the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, without the United States. The US trade war with China and undermining of the World Trade Organization appellate process, amongst other measures, indicated the US had abandoned its earlier leadership of globalization and interdependence. The ideological tendency in US narratives is important, I think, to understand as shaping the international discussion about rising China and as perhaps previewing what will be it appears, the next great US challenge, following America's previous focus on defeating international terrorism, and before that, its missionary focus on defeating international communism. Kissinger had long described how the US acts on realist imperatives, but it characterises its actions with liberal intentions. And Mearsheimer, too, notes the unrealistic US belief that it can make the world in its image. Indeed, Walt, as well, another international relations expert, argues that US liberals and realists alike have traditionally tended to characterise America's rivals as illegitimate, which inevitably leads to a push for regime change and often war, rather than to address the geopolitical and interdependent factors driving rivals' actions. As Xi Jinping's China doubled down on its authoritarianism at home while pursuing interdependence on its own terms abroad, US liberals became disillusioned that China had not followed some other East Asian economies that had liberalised their political systems as they became richer. US conservatives also became disillusioned with interdependence, signified by the election of Donald Trump, of course, as president in 2016, on a wave of populist anti-China sentiment. Trump's Secretary of State in his first administration, Mike Pompeo, described the previous decades since Nixon's opening to China as blind engagement. Pompeo and other senior members of the first Trump administration evoked imagery of a revisionist Chinese empire that posed threats to Americans, a narrative that was widely adopted in presenting China as an ideological rival seeking to export its model to dominate the world. Now, I'm not here saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just describing what happened in the early 2020s or the late period of the decade before. This US mentality, I think we need to understand why did the US language change so dramatically after the election of Trump. Throughout the previous half-century, since the US had adopted Kissinger's strategic engagement with China, the US had retained a massive asymmetric advantage in the power balance. But by the financial crisis of 2008, it had become evident that the balance was changing. Even though the US and its allies retained an overwhelming superiority in global military power, China was rapidly modernising its own military and indeed staked its regional interests as a major power by militarising disputed islands in the South China Sea, through which much of its and 1/5 of the world's maritime trade flowed. The US had, since the Second World War, maintained exclusive sea control in the Pacific. But China's growing maritime capabilities now established it as a rival. China also began engaging in increasingly abrasive diplomacy, rejecting Western assumptions of leadership and seeking what it considered due recognition of China's place in the world. Although China's actions were not yet at least, as aggressive as the actions of other rising powers in the past, increasingly assertive Chinese actions and language nevertheless unnerved many of its neighbours, and particularly the US. Further, the Chinese actions reflected an emerging opinion within China that it should become more assertive as a major power, and its brusque wolf war diplomacy, mirroring Trump-style communications, reinforced an image of offensive and even aggressive intent, while China had in recent decades exhibited a realist understanding of its limited power. By the second decade of the century, it was starting to be offensively realist about testing its growing power in the new balance. Now, what does offensively realist mean? Well, Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism suggests that we should expect rising China will inevitably seek to dominate Asia and then project power globally, and that the US and its allies will collaborate to contain China's rise. This theoretical framework became increasingly influential in the international relations discourse as confidence in interdependence with China declined, with regular assertions that China was indeed seeking regional hegemony and global power. Allison's Destined for War, very interesting book by Graham Allison, was widely misread as claiming that the Thucydides trap would generate an inevitable clash between China and the US, despite a closer reading of that book revealing that not every rise of a great power and decline of another leads to the so-called Thucydides trap, but actually conflict is only one of the scenarios that Graham Allison examines in that book, and well worth reading, as I said. A new US national security strategy in 2017 designated China a strategic competitor. This was the big change. Since that time, the US has engaged in economic warfare with its rival, including massive tariffs against Chinese goods, export controls to choke key Chinese supply chains such as semiconductors, and a campaign against leading Chinese firms such as Huawei and ZTE or ZTE, depending on which accent you use. People-to-people links were also severed, with new restrictions on migration, media and scientific collaboration. Trump encouraged a discourse of decoupling from China, eagerly taken up by think tanks and media across the West. Many of those think tanks, of course, US funded. But it generated, or at least so far, very little convincing academic literature, as the US and China remain in reality deeply economically interdependent. The apparently inexorable rise of China has generated deep anxiety in the broader West as well, with public opinion of China plunging at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the globe. The US and a growing number of its allies have adopted normative narratives about China in which every point of interdependence with China is characterized as a security threat. This new narrative generates a whole new set of risks for a huge array of international businesses, as most global value chains are deeply integrated with China. It is unclear whether the worst-case scenarios imagined in the geopolitical discourse are firmly based, although to be sure, there are widely different perceptions of world order between the two rival powers. Expectations of confrontation and conflict appear to be driving actions that in turn transform the operating environment from one of complexity to one of imagined simplicity and taking sides. There is little space in the current narratives for a multiple scenario discussion about what future good global governance might look like in cooperation with China. Few leaders in the West suggest that China's institutional entrepreneurship, its creation of new platforms of geo-economic interdependence, from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to the Belt and Road Initiative, provide any of the answers. China's new initiatives are more commonly framed as threats to world order. Nevertheless, just as in the globalization era, it is likely that Asian leaders will innovate and contribute to global interdependence in different ways than Western policy prescriptions, and it is uncertain whether the outcomes of such innovations may be positive sum or whether they must be feared as threats. A normatively sceptical understanding of China's evolving approach to world order is therefore critical in order to proportionately assess risks and opportunities. In the absence of any signs that the leaders of the US and China will seek to accommodate each other's interests and strike a deal to share power in the decade ahead, it appears we must prepare for the risks of major power confrontation and conflict and the reverberation of such risks throughout the multiple other disruptions underway. Now, of course, today, reading this that was written a couple of years ago before it was published this year, perhaps we actually are headed to a more pragmatic deal, if you like, between a re-elected Donald Trump and a Xi Jinping who needs to maintain China's interdependence with the US and with Western economies. So perhaps things are not as dire as they appeared a few years ago, but the language, the frameworks of discussion are still very much threat-based. And so I believe we need to maintain a little bit of skepticism about those narratives and look more carefully at key case studies and actually really drill down and understand where are the risks. There will be risks, but not to come to the discussion with a preset idea that everything on the China side is a risk and everything on the other side is hunky-dory. In fact, there are probably risks everywhere. Now, there are other risks that are happening at the same time. And so I'm going to continue reading because it's not just about the US-China conflict or contest, but actually there are many other geopolitical risks unfolding, and I'm not going to talk about them in any detail, but just to touch upon them because it is relevant that this unwinding of global order is happening elsewhere in the world as well, and not just between the US and China. Meanwhile, there is more to the new geopolitical risk environment than the US contest with China alone. Russia has long been involved in a series of low-level conflicts on its borders and cyber attacks far beyond its borders, but its brazen invasion of Ukraine in 2022 triggered repercussions throughout the global economy and presaged future shocks. The scale and comprehensive nature of sanctions imposed on Russia and Russia's retaliation affected not only international business investment and trade, but the energy security of states dependent on Russian energy supplies. The combination of the war's impact and the subsequent sanctions created a shock to global supply chains for energy and food, driving up inflation and generating economic insecurity across the developing world, and I should say also the developed world, and is still the case. The comprehensive sanctions adopted by the US and its allies against Russia and their dramatic impact raises the stakes for the next time a country embarks on military invasion without UN Security Council endorsement. China is widely understood to have observed the lesson of sanctions in its own planning for a future military contingency in relation to Taiwan. The inclusion in the US sanctions against Russia of SWIFT, which is the US-controlled Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, international payments, in other words, struck a particular fear in China, which as the world's leading trading nation relies much more than Russia on US dollar transactions. If SWIFT sanctions were one day turned upon China itself, it could wreak havoc on the Chinese financial system and all those businesses, by the way, who rely upon it. Chinese ambitions to internationalize its own currency can now be expected, therefore, to be moved into a higher gear of implementation, including more trade settlements in renminbi. The deteriorating geopolitical contest amongst the great powers creates a less stable environment in which other, more localized conflicts and crises may unfold in flashpoints around the world. Indeed, the great powers may also compete in seeking to determine the outcome of such localized problems as during the Cold War, which may even generate the potential for proxy wars between major powers. The Ukraine risk is that it is the first such proxy war of the new era, in which great powers have little interest in conflict mediation or resolution, and everything to gain from anticipating a, no matter how unlikely, zero-sum victory. And of course, I haven't mentioned here conflict in the Middle East, in Africa, in other parts of the world. But clearly, world order is under enormous strain. Now, there's another huge seismic risk that is unfolding in the world at the same time as these geopolitical risks. And perhaps it's geopolitical as well. And this is the new risks of the technological revolution that is underway without any roadmap. At the same time as the changing world order and the crisis of interdependence discussed earlier, the global economy is on the cusp of a new industrial revolution. Technologies including quantum computing, artificial intelligence or AI, and high-speed communications promise to construct a new smart digitalized network of devices, or Internet of Things as it's sometimes called, that will significantly change the structure of the global economy and have potentially disruptive social, political and environmental impacts. Digitalization, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, promises to transform energy, industrial production, logistics, consumption and waste management with disruptive changes to business, supply chains and global, national and local economies. The new technologies are expected to radically improve efficiencies, reduce costs, and in the process of connectivity, yield huge quantities of data or data, depending on your accent, to target products, services and solutions to meet individual or organizational needs. The new technologies promise to generate new sustainable industries and supply chains to address the global challenge of climate change, but we just don't understand yet what this new industrial revolution is really going to look like as it unfolds, because we're at the beginning. These new digitalised connectivities underpinned by automated decision-making will introduce significantly more complex interdependence. Yet there's no international understanding of this yet. New international and domestic rules, norms and institutions to govern such automated decision-making and complex digital interdependence are barely yet under consideration. Governments are only just starting to think through the regulatory questions around this, and it's interdependent, these technologies. These technologies don't really know borders. The new technologies raise questions about values underpinning new business models, rules, norms and standards in relation to public goods as well as personal privacy. For individuals, life will become increasingly virtualised and connected, raising philosophical questions too about how we apply our intelligence and interact with our environment as humans. Cybersecurity risks will expand exponentially with the deepening and broadening of the digital economy. The new technologies raise important cybersecurity and other challenges for national security, with state actors, criminal groups and hackers actively exploring the potential for cyber sabotage across an ever-enlarging digital economy, combined with geopolitical pressure points such as China's dominance in some global technology value chains and US dominance in others, as well as disruptive new platform businesses on a scale hitherto unknown in the international economy. The next phase of technological innovation also raises questions about whether globalization is unraveling or simply getting started. And the uncertainty underpinning scenarios for how new technologies will impact society, politics and the environment as much as the shape of the future economy. New technology is particularly important to developing nations, which have fewer opportunities than earlier developing nations to leverage low-value manufacturing for growth, and they'll need to jump to higher value economic activities to continue on the path to development. China is actively positioning itself to be a leader of these new transformational technologies and is seeking to influence the development of global rules and standards for the digital economy. The US perceives Chinese leadership in such areas as generating security threats, in particular if Chinese firms provide equipment and services to build capabilities for espionage and influence, and if Chinese developed rules and standards entrench state power rather than individual rights. This generates a whole new set of risks to international businesses, governments and communities. Digital connectivity has moved to the centre of the new geopolitical contest, with technology weaponised on both sides by state actors to gain advantage and exploit rivals' vulnerabilities, as well as to protect against new cyber risks. To be sure, markets will be massively disrupted by these transformational technologies, and how states govern the transition. The risks to economics, the risks to businesses, the risks to communities from a new techno-nationalist decoupling and deepening ideological contest on the verge of a fourth industrial revolution cannot be overestimated. A failure to develop rules and institutions to guide safe and human-centred deployment of technologies would be a signature failure of global governance. In the past, even at times of geopolitical confrontation, it has proved possible to develop relatively stable international rules and institutions, for example, for nuclear safety, for aviation, for food security and the like. Yet the future for rules governing technology is entirely unclear. Whether rules and a predictable operating environment can be developed by normative leaders such as the EU, or whether the digital world will fragment into rival zones, will fundamentally challenge the value chains of the future. While we're in the early stages of these new technologies, we are already experiencing risks unforeseen at the birth of the internet. The early digital economy evolved with no agreed set of international rules, norms or standards. The public good opportunities of the information age appeared evident to most participants in the early era of globalization, with billions interacting with platforms such as Google and Facebook, and notably those firms adopted values that mirrored the US faith in open information exchange and was subsequently banned in authoritarian China. Yet the risks of information free-for-all were evident by the second decade of this century, with the destruction of the business model for professional media and the rise of disinformation as a social and political phenomenon that rocked even the foundations of US democracy, as well as fueling ethno-nationalist populism around the world. The business model of the new giant monopolistic digital platform companies to surveil and monetize data, depending on your accent, on users, has introduced a new set of risks that remain matters of intense debate in open and closed societies alike. So here I'm pointing out that the new technological risks are enormous because we are interconnected, and yet both sides, US and China, are taking quite different approaches to these, and both are seeing the companies from the other as risks. And there are risks here. There are serious risks here. So having an open mind about trying to look at those risks, identify them and analyse them, and to manage those risks is going to require us stepping back from taking just a position that might be a US or a China position, actually look at what is going on with technology. And then, of course, there's another set of risks. So I'm going to continue here because these are all happening at the same time. The existential risks of the climate crisis. At the same time as nations are engaged in a new geopolitical contest and grappling with the economic and technological disruption, global cooperation is needed like never before to respond to existential climate crisis. Climate change knows no national borders and obeys no governments. Complex ecosystems across the globe are under unprecedented pressure, and the climate is shifting rapidly as a result of human actions, generating higher average temperatures, more severe and frequent natural disasters, rising sea levels, etc. Now, I'll come back to that, and we'll continue next time in looking at how all of these risks are converging in the 2020s and why we need to talk about these risks in understanding how do we manage the rise of China.